Hello and welcome to Topic 5, Lecture 1. And this week we are going to be taking a look at gender and political participation. And in this set of slides, we're going to take a look at the so-called gender gap and the impact that it has on voting and other forms of political participation. Okay, so what are we going to be taking a look at in this lecture? Well, first we're going to look at voter turnout and the difference that we have in terms of men and women turning out to vote in an election. We're going to take a look at the difference in public opinion as it relates to gender. And then we're going to take a look at party affiliation or party identification and the gender gap. And then we'll conclude this by looking at the power of the voting bloc. So let's get started. Okay, so as we know from our last chapter, that when women got the right to vote in 1920, they did not show up to the voting booth. As we know, the hope for the manifestation of the women's vote just did not materialize. Women did not vote in high numbers. And as we know from last week, there were lots of speculations about why that was. Maybe women really were not that interested in participating in politics after all. And so we know that it took a long time for women to begin voting at the same rate as men. And it was in 1980, so it really took about 60 years for women to vote at the same rate as men. And since 1980, women have a higher voter turnout rate than men do. So just to make sure that everybody is on the same page, when we talk about voter turnout, we're looking at the number of people who vote divided by the eligible voter pool. So let's say that you live in a city and there are 100 people who are eligible to vote and 60 people show up to vote. The voter turnout rate for that town would be 60%, okay? And so when we talk about voter turnout, we're talking about it as a rate or a percentage of the eligible voters. Now, in the United States, in a presidential election, we generally have voter turnout. That's the time during a presidential election. That's when the most people turn out to vote in the United States, okay? And that makes sense. People are paying attention. Presidential elections get a lot of media coverage. There are lots of debates that are dedicated to it. And so, you get the highest level of voter turnout at that time period. And in the last, 20 years or so, we've seen a voter turnout rate of all voters between about 52% of people voting to a high of about 62%. Okay, so it ranges in the low 50s to the low 60s. So that gives you a sense of what general voter turnout rate is in the United States. Women have a much higher percentage, they have a higher voter turnout rate in the United States than do men. And so when you look at the number of eligible women who can vote, 63% of eligible women show up at the voting booth, compared to 59% of men who show up to vote. And so that's a difference of about 4 percentage points, okay? That may not seem like that big of a deal. However, we know that there are more women than men within our population. And when you look at everybody who voted in the United States in 2016 in this example, but women have outpaced men at the voting booth for quite some time. It wasn't just in 2016. There wasn't something unique about 2016. But women make up a larger percentage of the overall electorate in the United States. And so, as it says there, that women make up 55% of all people who vote, and women show up at a greater rate. And that has a big implication in terms of elections. 13 million more voters were women, okay? And as we're going to see in a little bit, that might not make a big difference if women didn't vote any differently than men, but women do vote differently than men. Women are much more likely to support the Democratic Party and the Democratic candidate. And so when you look at the gender gap, it has these pretty significant implications for electoral politics in the United States. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, that women have consistently outperformed men, have a higher level of turnout rate than men, and that's not a new phenomenon. And so you look at in 1980, where turnout rates between men and women were about the same. But then you look at today, or 2016, and that's likely to continue on into, the 2020 presidential election as well, if not get bigger, that we see that, women have, kind of been pretty consistent in terms of their voting at about 63%. And since about 2004, we see a little bit of a decline in the participation of men in in elections. Okay, so anyways, it just sort of shows you that the general trend is sort of similar. We have higher rates of turnout in 92, lower rates during the late 90s and the early 2000s, and then a little bit higher rates, but the gap persists between voter turnout between men and women. Okay. So women are more likely to vote than men. Well, why is that? What is the reason for women having a higher voter turnout rate? Well, political scientists have studied this, and there's no consensus on what causes it, right? In social science, it's hard to say that X causes Y, but instead we sort of look at correlations, and we also look at some plausible theories that seem to make sense of why there is a difference. And here are some of the theories about why women are more likely to turn out to vote. One of the theories is that women deal with government in their day-to-day lives more than men. And why is that? Well, women are more likely to be poor than men. And we're going to talk about that later in the semester. It's called the feminization of poverty. That since women they have a higher rate of poverty, that's often because in divorces, women keep custody or primary custody of the children. Women also oftentimes make less than men, and so we have a higher rate of poverty among women than men. That means that women are more likely to be dependent on safety net services such as food stamps or housing vouchers, welfare, and other forms of income subsidies. And so because women sort of deal with government in their day-to-day life more than men and feel that they're more dependent upon these governmental policies, they might feel like they're more invested in the system. That's sort of what the theory is. And so that since their real lives are impacted by government, they're more likely to show up at the voting booth because they know what it would mean if that they lost that governmental support. And so exposure to governmental policy makes outcomes more salient for women. Women are also more likely to be the primary caregiver. And so they're more likely to be responsible for childcare, more responsible for taking kids to doctor's appointments, more responsible for elder care. We see gender gaps in terms of child care and gender gaps in terms of taking care of older parents. And that's another way in which government impacts the lives of women perhaps more than men. They might be more aware of not having paid maternity leave or paid parental leave. They might be more aware of the cost of daycare. They might be more aware of the impact that taking care of an elder parent may have on their jobs and other aspects of their lives. So those are just some theories. A final theory that political scientists have looked at is that there's some changing social norms. That under 65, more women vote than men, but over 65, more men vote than women. So we can kind of understand the over 65 aspect of that because that is still a reflection of sort of the separate spheres thinking about politics. The under 65 is more interesting. I mean, it seems like we would have more parity in voter turnout between women and men. But we don't see that. So it could very well likely be that women have higher rates of trust in government than men, and there's some evidence to back that up, and other attitudes about government that might impact turning out to vote. Okay, before we look at gender and party identification, let's take a look at gender gaps in public opinion. Because if we see the difference in attitudes that women have versus men about some political issues and policies, then it's going to help us understand why women are more likely to identify with the Democratic Party. Just to get everybody up, on the same page, public opinion is basically the attitudes that people have about policies, events, elected officials, and politics, right? So if I were to ask you, do you approve of the job that President Trump is doing in handling the coronavirus? If you have an attitude about that, you think he's doing a great job or you think he's, doing a horrible job, whatever your attitude is, that's an example of your public opinion, right? Do you support universal background checks on purchasing of guns? However you answer that, that's what your public opinion is, okay? It's your attitudes that you have about political issues, events, and policies. Women and men hold different opinions on several key issues. However, one place where you think there might be a difference in terms of attitudes between men and women would be abortion, and that's not the case. We do not see a gender gap, a significant gender gap, and we haven't for a while when it comes to the issue of abortion. So let's take a look at some of the differences in opinions between men and women. Okay, so here is a table from the Pew Research Center that takes a look at different attitudes on public policy issues and it shows the gender gap. And in some cases, the gender gap is fairly significant, even when you're thinking about maybe the margin of error of plus or minus 3%. Having a difference in opinion between men and women that's, in double digits or close to double digits is pretty significant. So let's take a look at those that agree that same-sex marriage should be legal in all or most cases, that women are, much more supportive of that than men, agree that religious institutions that object to contraceptive use should be given an exemption from insurance mandates. Women don't think that religious organizations or institutions should be exempt from the Affordable Care Act, for example. Believes that government does not do enough for the poor people. Again, a 10-point gap. Believes that the best way to ensure peace is through good diplomacy. Women are more likely to support diplomatic solutions rather than military solutions. And when it comes to attitudes about protecting the environment, we see strong support from that for both men and women, but even stronger support from that among women. There's a lot of speculation in terms of why we see these different gender gaps. Again, it could come down to if women are more likely to be poor, then they might feel like government needs to do more for the poor. That because of the way people are socialized, gender socialization, women are sort of socialized to be more cooperative, and so that might support the women wanting to seek diplomatic solutions, etc. But regardless of the reasons, we see that there are these significant gaps. This is an interesting graph from, again, the Pew Research Center that looks at attitudes that women have regarding the size of government, okay? And so, there's different opinions. Some people think that government should be bigger and should offer a lot more services, right? That government should be more involved in our lives. Some people think that government is too big, that government's part of the problem, that the best government is a very small government that's not very involved in your life. Um, that this is really interesting when you look at the trend in public opinion. And so the dark blue line is saying that those are people who want bigger government, more governmental services. The tan line is saying that these are the people who want like less government services, want a smaller government. Look at the current gap in 2019, and look at really sort of the shift in opinion for women, because you see on the men's side of the graph, um, men have consistently been more supportive or more in favor of smaller government that gives us fewer services. It's changed. If anything, it's grown, right? That more men think that we need less government and less services. But it's fairly consistent, when you look from 2007 to 2019. Boy, that's really not the case. When you look at women, there is quite some period of time, and that is during the Obama administration, when we do see growing government interventions in our life, in particular to respond to the Great Recession, we really see that women are sort of split equally among saying bigger and smaller government. But with the election of Donald Trump, that has changed quite significantly. And you see that many, many more women are supportive of bigger government and more services. And so that's an interesting difference in terms of public opinion and the gender gap. Okay, now if I had asked you at the beginning of this lecture, how many of you think that there is a gender gap when it comes to attitudes about abortion? I bet you a lot of you would say, yeah, women are more likely to support legal access to abortion. They're less likely to want to see Roe v. Wade overturned. That they are more pro-choice, right, supportive of reproductive freedoms than men. That is not the case. As we see here, and these are trends that have been stable for quite some period of time, that when you look at this graph, if the bar says dark blue, that means that the person's opinion is that abortion should be legal in all or most cases. And that when you look at the light blue, that indicates that you think that abortion should be illegal in all or most cases. As you see there, that 60% of women say that it should be legal in all or most cases, as do 61% of men. Okay. And so there is not a gender gap when it comes to support for legalized abortion. And on the flip side of that, men are just as likely to be pro-life as are women, right? It's around in the 30 percentile there. And so, that's really interesting. And it leads us to sort of think about, okay, well, if it's not gender that's driving attitudes about abortion, well, like what is like driving a person's attitude regarding abortion? And I think the answer to that is religion. Okay, that the more religious a person is, particularly if they're evangelical Protestant, the more likely, or Catholic, the more likely they are to be pro-life. And so in this case, when it comes to attitudes, religious affiliation trumps your gender affiliation. Okay, that it's interesting to see how that plays itself out in public opinion. Okay, so that brings us to the gender gap in party identification. Okay, So party identification is basically the party that you affiliate with, right? So if I asked you, do you identify as a Democrat or a Republican or an independent, that is that you had no party affiliation, the way you answer that question is your party ID, right? So if I ask you, which party do you identify with, and you say, I identify as a Republican, well, that's your party identification. Now, when it comes to independents, usually pollsters will ask, okay, you identify as an independent, but if you had to choose, do you lean Republican or do you lean Democratic? Okay. So oftentimes people who say they're independent but lean to one party or the other end up voting for that party. Okay. And so they usually include so-called leaners in some of the poll when we're doing polling to get a sense of the correlation between party identification and issue support. Okay. But anyways, getting back to this, prior to the 1980s, there was not a big difference in the way men and women voted. Okay. That starting in the 1980s, men and women showed up at the polls at the same rate. But in the, up until the 1980s, just as many men voted for the Democrats as did women, and just as many women voted for the Republicans as did men. They were men and women were equally split between the parties, and that's because they're equally split between the parties, and that's really because, as we saw with the ERA and our chapter on the ERA, the Republican president, President Nixon is supportive of the ERA, and he's supportive of other gender equality bills. He signs the Title IX into law. You see that both Republicans and Democrats, support the ERA, and there's strong bipartisan support for that as it moves through Congress. And so up until 1980, when it came to gender issues, there were huge differences, and that's even true with abortion as well. Roe v. Wade's in 1972. We're going to be learning about that in the next chapter. And so even there, there weren't divisions like we have today when it comes to gender issues. That all changes in 1980. So by 1980, the women's voting bloc manifests, and it stays in place until today. And what does that mean? Well, women as a voting bloc mean that women begin voting for a particular party. And starting in the 1980s, they start voting for the Democratic Party. Women are much more likely to identify with the Democrats than the Republicans. Well, why the heck is that? Well, why 1980? Well, it's at that point where we really see the rise of the so-called culture war. Okay. And we see intimations of that during the struggles to pass the ERA. You see the rise of Phyllis Schlafly and the rise of the women in the Republican Party. You also see the rise of evangelical Christians in the United States. They're no longer sitting on the sidelines, but they're getting involved in politics in numbers that they never had before. And so, and then the GOP, that's the Republican Party, the grand old party, they begin affiliating with the evangelical right and other more far-right aspects within the United States political and social culture. And so starting in the 1980s, the GOP pivots right, especially on the culture war. Or especially on women's issue. And it really is sort of the start of the culture war that we see alive and well today. Here are just some pictures from that time period. So we see on the left Phyllis Schlafly and the Stop ERA. You see on the right the second wave feminists who are fighting for the ERA. But below that, you begin to see the rise of the political right within the Republican Party and also within the evangelical community. And so on the left-hand side is Ronald Reagan, who, when he was governor of California, he was pro-choice. but he sees that it's politically advantageous to begin aligning with this rising right-wing movement in the United States because he sees that as a pathway to electoral success, and indeed it was. On the right-hand side there is Jerry Falwell, who is the leader of the moral majority, right? And so up until the 1980s, evangelical Christians, they stayed out of politics for the most part. They had their eye on the afterlife. They had their eye on the world of God, and they didn't have their eye on the world of men, the world of politics. Well, that changed in the 1980s in large response to the civil rights movements and the liberation movements, the gay liberation movements, the women's liberations movements. Evangelicals were against that, the rise of legal abortions. Evangelicals were against that, and they let themselves be known by organizing, okay? And so that helps us understand this shift that we see within the two parties and the move of women to support the Democratic Party. So this graph shows you the gender gap in party identification. As you see there, that women are much more likely to identify with the Democrats or to lean Democratic, 56 to 38%. Whereas you see that men, the red line is for the Republicans, are more likely to identify with the Republicans than the Democratic Party, and quite significantly, right? 56% of women identify with Democrats, only 42% of men identify with the Democratic Party. And, this slide takes a look at, we need to keep in mind that just because women are more likely to identify with the Democratic Party doesn't mean that all women identify with the Democratic Party. A significant percentage of the electorate in the United States, in the women's electorate of the United States, identify with the Republican Party, and same with men, right? And so women and men are not monolithic groups. They all don't vote the same way. That your race impacts which party that you identify with. Your age impacts which party you identify with. And as this slide shows, whether or not you have a college degree impacts the party that you identify with. So check it out. That on the top, we see men with no college degree and women with no college degree. And so we're asking these people which party they identify with. That you see that there's less of a gender gap, okay, between men and women who have college degrees. We still see that men are more likely to support the Republican Party than women, but women without college degrees are less likely to support the Democratic Party than the general population of women. And boy, oh boy, check out this gap here on the bottom part of this graph. When you look at men who have college degrees or beyond baccalaureate and who are college graduates or beyond, there is no gap, okay? That men with college degrees are just as likely to support the Republican Party as they are the Democratic Party. There's a little bit of a gap, but it's not, significant. But look at the difference between women with college degrees and their party identification. There's a huge gap. And so women with college degrees are much more likely to support the Democratic Party than women, than the Republican Party. And that difference is, significant in terms of the general population. And newsflash, more women are in college than are men, and more women are likely to get a college degree than men. And so again, keep that in the mix as you're sort of thinking about the electoral implications for this. So what are the implications for gender gap in party identification? Well, we saw coming out of the passage of the 19th Amendment that if women don't form a voter bloc, that is, women didn't show up to vote, and not only that, but the women who did show up to vote didn't really vote differently than men. And so, we read in our articles for last week that you lose a lot of political power. If you're not seen as a voting bloc that's going to vote a certain way for certain candidates, for certain parties, for certain issues, you're likely to be ignored by elected officials and by political parties. But if you're a voter bloc, you have a lot more potential for political power. If more women are likely to vote for the Democratic Party, and on the flip side of that, if more men are likely to vote for the Republican Party, then you see that they have, political power. If Republicans want to win, they need to court the male vote. If Democrats want to win, they need to court the women's vote, right? And so being a voter bloc has the potential for having political power. Candidates and parties may see a voting bloc as key to their electoral success. It actually sort of amazes me that the Republican Party hasn't done a better job at reaching out to the women's vote. After Mitt Romney lost the election in 2012, there was a reckoning within the Republican Party that basically said, you know what? If we want to win the next election, we really need to reach out to women voters. Well, the Republican Party selected Trump as their nominee, and a lot of that kind of went to the wayside, right? So it'll be interesting to see if Donald Trump loses in 2020, whether or not there will be sort of a reckoning in the Republican Party to see, to sort of do a better job of wooing women to rejoin their party. The bottom line is candidates and parties may see the voting bloc as key to an electoral success, and as such, they will woo that bloc. Okay, if they want to, if they see that as advantageous for them winning elections. We definitely see some of that within the Democratic Party. But it is sort of interesting that, at least when it came to who they nominated for their presidential nominee, there were many women on that stage, but for whatever reason, and I kind of get it, the Democrats decided to go with an older white guy to go up against Donald Trump. I think a lot of that had to do with sort of the backlash, the fear of what happened with Hillary Clinton, and they wanted to make sure that the Democratic Party can beat Trump. But it is kind of interesting that those kinds of choices were made. All right, well, that's it for this lecture. The next lecture, we're going to take a look at gender gap within representation, gender gap within the Congress. All right, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you later.